The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Fight Colorectal Cancer webinar on compassion fatigue. So today we are excited to have Teresa Deshields as our webinar presenter, talking about compassion fatigue. If you have a question during the session, please type in the question in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will do a moderated Q&A at the end of the session. If you have Twitter, you can follow along, following the hashtag CRC webinar. And of course, if you are unable to watch the whole recording live or you'd like to revisit it at a later date, the webinar is being recorded and will go up onto our website by this evening or tomorrow morning, so you can access it there. Fight CRC has a very thorough library of resources. Some of those resources include our Tabooty podcast series, our mini magazines, and our late-stage MSS CRC trial finder. To learn more about these resources, you can visit fightcrc.org. The information and services provided by Fight Colorectal Cancer are for general informational purposes only. The information and services are not intended to be substitutes for professional medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment. If you are ill or suspect that you are ill, please see a doctor immediately, and in an emergency, call 911 or go to the nearest emergency room. Finally, Fight Colorectal Cancer never recommends or endorses any specific physicians, products, or treatments for any condition. And we are super excited to have Teresa on today. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and a clinical associate professor in the Department of Medicine and Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. She's a fellow of APOS, the American Psychosocial Oncology Society, and is its current president until, I believe, the end of this month. She's just a fantastic presenter, and we're super excited to have her here today. And of course, thank you to the Fight CRC team and all of your help in getting the webinar up and running. So Dr. Deshields, I'll let you go ahead and take it from here. Let me hand over the control to you.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. So we're going to be talking about compassion, fatigue, and resilience. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have those questions, be sure to post them on the site so that we can get to them at the end of the presentation. Let's dive right in. So let's see. Now for some reason my slides aren't coming down. Let's see.
We can see your slides.
But, oh, there we go. Now I just couldn't get it to advance. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is compassion fatigue? In case you haven't heard that term before, it's something that's getting more attention in the literature, but let's review what it is. The definition that I like is that compassion fatigue is the combination of secondary traumatic stress and burnout together. And you may have heard of burnout. That's also gotten some attention in the popular press. We're going to talk about what those two things are, just in case they aren't familiar to you. So secondary traumatic stress is kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder, if you've heard of that. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a term that's used when people are traumatized by an event. So they're having trouble getting over something drastic that happened to them. It's usually something life-threatening. But with secondary traumatic stress, people can be traumatized by others' experiences. So not that it's something they have directly experienced, but the suffering or the trauma of others. So this is something that can happen with caregivers. It can happen with healthcare professionals. It can happen with friends. Again, when you are exposed to the suffering of someone else, you can have some ripple effects from that. An example is there was a VA psychologist when post-traumatic stress disorder was becoming well known shortly after the Vietnam War. There was a VA psychologist who interviewed many, many veterans coming back from Vietnam and helped us in our understanding of this disorder. But he said that at some point he started having nightmares about war, even though he had never been to war, but he had nightmares about the experiences he'd heard about from the individuals he talked to. So that's an example of secondary traumatic stress. And of course, if you have close proximity to someone who is suffering or repeated exposure, that makes you more vulnerable. So burnout, again, is a term that might be a little more familiar to people. Burnout is something that can happen anywhere, in any job situation. It's generally the situation where you feel like that the resources that you have, that you bring to the table, are not enough for the situation you're in. So that may happen in a work situation if you feel like this job has just tapped me, depleted me, I don't have enough, I can't meet the demands that are placed on me. It can also happen in a caregiving role. If you feel like you have just been worn out and depleted by the caregiving role and the duties that you have with that, and that you worry that you might not be able to meet the future demand. This can also happen in people who have gotten exhausted by their treatment, but in that case, it's I don't know what we haven't called it burnout. You might see that term applied. It could be the same thing, that just feeling like, okay, I'm not sure that I can meet the demands of this treatment. I'm not sure I can do it anymore. I'm just exhausted. Now, I'm showing you a slide now that has some common characteristics of compassion fatigue. And these are very common experiences. So having one of these does not mean that you have compassion fatigue. It's more concerning if you have a bunch of these. If you're looking at this list and you see yourself all over it, if you resonate to a number of these, that might be some concern, something you should be thinking about as we're going through this presentation, that this might be an issue for you. Some particularly common ones are, you can see some of the physical experiences of just maybe losing your appetite or feeling hungry all the time, weight loss or gain, trouble sleeping, fatigue. So there's some physical elements, but there's also some other emotional elements, like feeling numb or feeling irritable or angry, dreading, maybe having an experience of dread of going into a situation where you think that you might not be prepared for or be able to meet the expectations. And all of these things can contribute to relational problems. You might be having difficulty with relationships because your irritability or feeling overwhelmed or something like that. So that's where those things can be related. But again, this is not, you don't have to have all these symptoms. It doesn't mean you have compassion fatigue if you have one of them, but if you are relating to a number of these, it might be something to pay attention to. So let's talk about some things that make people vulnerable to compassion fatigue. First of all, in your care situation, so factors related to that. If you are feeling that it's too much, there's a lot of work to do, that the work is never done, that you can't ever catch up, perhaps if there's time pressure involved, there's things that you have to do in a time-sensitive manner, that can add to the pressure. If you don't have a lot of help, if you are bearing the burden of caregiving alone, or you feel like you don't have support in your workplace as a healthcare professional. Also, if you have a lot of exposure to illness, either through a long-term illness of a person you're caring for, or that you've had multiple people that you've been caring for that have been ill or who have died. And that can sometimes happen if you're very engaged in advocacy, an advocacy organization like Fight Colorectal Cancer or something like that, where you come to know a lot of people who are dealing with illness. And just the more involved you are, you may know more people who are sick or struggling, or people who have died, just in that context. And so that can make you more vulnerable. Personal factors. So it's also important how you respond to things and how you, who you are as a person. So some people are better at, and I say work, sometimes when I'm meaning work here, it doesn't have to be actually your job. It can be the work of caregiving. But some people are better at balancing their work or their duties and their leisure. So you hear that called sometimes work-life balance. And some people are better at that than others. You may know for yourself, maybe you describe yourself as a workaholic, or other people might describe you that way, where you are always engaged in work, or saying yes to work and maybe turning down other things. So that can be a compromising factor. Also perfectionism, so how hard you drive yourself in terms of the quality of your work. Some people are just very hard on themselves in terms of not allowing for any leeway, or not allowing for the very human mistakes that all of us would commit. Social support is also important, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. So do you have a good support system, and whether that's informal or a formal support system? And also, are you comfortable using your support system? So you can have a very rich support system, but not be someone who is comfortable leaning on others, and so bearing your burdens on your own without allowing others to help support you either emotionally or practically. Then the other thing here on this slide is about the caregiving experience. So if you are a caregiver and feeling like this may relate to you, so what is that caregiving experience like? Is this something that you're doing every day? Is this something that you're doing for multiple hours a day? Is this something you're doing in addition to trying to work full-time? Are you sharing the caregiving load with other family members? Are there paid caregivers who come in? And do you are you responsible for all aspects of that person's care? How independent or dependent are they? So are you doing lots of hands-on caregiving? Are you just more like checking in, running errands? There's very different aspects of caregiving, so that can influence how this is impacting you. So I want to take a moment and make sure that I mention compassion satisfaction. This isn't something that you hear about very much, and that makes me very sad that we don't hear about this part of it. And it is a real thing as well, just like compassion fatigue is. And this is your ability to enjoy or feel satisfied with what you do. So if you feel like that in your caregiving role, that you're doing something very important, that is valuable to you, that it's a great service that you're providing, that you are benefiting someone else, and you feel good about it, that drives compassion satisfaction. So finding meaning and purpose in what you do, and believing that what you do makes a difference and is important, that also impacts you. And compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue are not inversely related. You can have both, or you can be missing both, but you can feel very worn down by the work that you're doing as a caregiver, professional or family caregiver. But you can also feel like it's very important and feel pleased that you're able to do that, feel like it's an important thing to do. You can have both of those qualities at the same time. Now, in the literature, and I'm not going to get into the literature too much here, but in the literature, you can see in the oncology setting, when they have examined compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction, that people can have both simultaneously. So what we want to try to do here is focus on how to grow compassion satisfaction and how to diminish compassion fatigue. So that's going to be our goal here, to be able to ratchet up one while we dial down the other. Okay, I love Viktor Frankl, and so I've got two quotes of his in here. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who in Vienna, and he was sent to a concentration camp by the Nazis in World War II. And he was intrigued by the way that some of those concentration camp prisoners coped better or managed better than others emotionally with the experience. And he he wrote about that after he survived the concentration camp, and he wrote about his experiences trying to understand about why that was. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and part of it, the title came from the fact that he thought that having a meaning or purpose to what you're experiencing helps you to cope better. And here's this quote from him: "He who knows the why for his existence will be able to bear almost any how." And you could swap out existence for experience, for caregiving role, whatever. Just understanding why you're doing what you're doing can help you to bear it better, tolerate it better. Okay, so we've talked a lot about caregiving here, whether that's something that you're doing as a job, whether that's something that you're doing out of love. And I want you to think for a minute why you do that. So think about why you do that. What led you to start down that path? What led you to say yes? What leads you to keep saying yes? So I'm going to give you just a moment to think about that. I'm going to give you just, I don't know, we'll do like 30 seconds to think about that. Try to bring that to mind for yourself. I'm just going to be quiet during this time so you can think. Okay, that was a very brief 30 seconds, but that's important to do. I want you to think about that again later, and it may even be helpful to write this out like a mission statement. Why you are doing what you're doing. Even though it may be hard on you, there's a reason that you do it, and I want you to think about what that is. And sometimes we get far away from that. We forget what brought us to choose that work, that service. And if you actually take the time to write something like this out, it's something that you can pull up in the future when you start to feel a little overwhelmed, maybe a little burnt out with what you're doing, to remind yourself of why you do that, why you've chosen that. That can be helpful. So I encourage you to go back at some point and do that. You got just a chance to start that process, but to think about it now. When I first learned about compassion fatigue years ago, it was probably maybe 10 years ago, that was one of the things that was most meaningful to me, to just try to reconnect with why I chose the work that I did as a psychologist in a cancer center, and why I stayed with that. So I want you to spend some time with that. Okay, now we're going to talk about resilience. And so resilience, what that word means, There's a little debate in the scientific literature about what is resilience. The most common definition is that resilience is about bouncing back. So you have difficult experiences or things are hard for you, but resilience is about recovering from that. So you got knocked off track, but you come back from it, and that's resilience. Now, some people, the minority, think about resilience as you never get knocked off track. Tough things happen to you, challenges come your way, but you are able to hold strong, hold steady despite that. Another kind of emerging definition of resilience is the idea that you might actually be improved by some of these challenges that you face. That by being exposed to these difficult things, by rising to the challenge, by meeting it, that somehow you come out better on the other side. You may have heard the term post-traumatic growth, and that says that people who are traumatized can actually grow from that experience and feel like they have been improved in some way. So we're going to be talking about resilience in, I don't know, you can pick which of those versions that you want. Maybe you feel like you've been knocked off track and would like to recover from what you've been experiencing. Maybe you feel like you've been doing okay, you're hanging in there, and we'll talk about some ways it might help you to continue that. Or maybe you would like to even explore the idea of, can I get better? Can I even be a better person because of this experience? And these things may help you to achieve that. So whichever version of that phrase that you like, that will apply here. And so there's 5 different strategies that we're going to talk about. The first one is self-regulation, and this works on the idea that secondary traumatic stress, that notion of, I didn't mean to advance that slide. So being exposed to the suffering of others increases your autonomic arousal or your physiological arousal. You get a little agitated or revved when you've been exposed to trauma, when you have witnessed that, when you've absorbed some of that, that your body can become like an engine that's idling fast. You can feel kind of on edge. You can be a little jumpy or a little sensitive. So this physiological arousal, it's important to find some way to settle your body down, to calm your body, to counter that. So that's what this is about. We're going to talk about some ways to help your body recover from that or maintain some more even keel or calmness in the face of difficulty. And I've listed here a variety of ways to do this. There's 2 of them that we're going to talk about in more detail, but I want you to notice of this list. So we have settle your breathing, practice mindfulness, soften your focus, listening to soothing music or nature sounds, or spending time in nature, or praying. That there are a variety of ways you can do this. So I'm not going to give you the one secret key for how to do this. I'm telling you that there's lots of different ways, and you can find what works for you. And there are ways that aren't on this list. You may know some other ways that you can find calm, that things that are soothing for you that aren't on this list. And that's fine. There's lots of ways to get there. So certainly having one tried and true way to get there is important, but the more options that you have, the easier it is for you to find the one that works for you in the moment when you need it. So let's talk about breathing. I'm going to have you do a breathing exercise. What I like about breathing is that you're doing that all the time anyway. You can work with your breathing in any situation, and nobody has to know that you're doing it. You have all the tools there. It's not obvious necessarily what you're doing, and you don't need to be in a special place or in special circumstances to do it. So I'm going to teach you a breathing strategy that helps to kind of settle the body. And what I want you to do first of all, I want you to do this along with me. I want you to first try to even out the phases of your breath. So we're going to even out your inhalations and your exhalations. The easiest way that I find to do that is to count. So count as you inhale and count as you exhale and get the two even. So make the counts match for those two. And give you a few moments to just get the inhalations and exhalations of your own breath even so that they match in length. So hopefully that is somewhat easy to do. And it doesn't matter what the length of those are. If one of them is longer than the other, you may need to shorten the longer one in order to have them match. However you get them to match is fine, and I don't have any particular goal of what the length is. Now, I do want to mention that some people, you may be in some setting, say a yoga class or wherever, where they talk about your breathing, and they may have you do your exhalation a little longer than your inhalation. That's fine. And if you prefer that, that's fine. You just don't want the opposite to be true. You don't want your inhalations to be longer than your exhalations. But if anything is longer, have it be your exhalation. So your count, if you used count to get the phases of your breath even, we're going to call that your pace. So whatever that count is, that's the pace of your breathing. And I want you to experiment for a minute about, and I don't mean a minute literally, but about changing the pace of your breathing. So say you could inhale for a count of 3 and exhale for a count of 3. See if you can stretch it to 4. No big deal. Just see if you can stretch it to 4. Again, I don't have any goal of what I want you to get to. This is just stretching out your breathing a little bit. So this is obviously an exercise that you can do anytime, anywhere. And if you think about someone sleeping, a baby, a dog even, a person, so how they breathe when they're sleeping. Generally, the breathing is very slow and steady. Unless, I don't know, if you bring a terrible snorer to mind, that might mess up the illustration here. But a person who doesn't have a snoring issue or sleep apnea, but that breathing that they do, it's usually very slow and steady. And that's all we're aiming for here, is just that relaxed breathing. And generally by focusing inward on your breath, it's a bit of a mindfulness exercise, and I'm going to use that as a segue to get us to the next slide. But you know, when we have the question and answer, if you have any question about this, you can certainly bring it up there and we could talk in more detail. But let's go to mindfulness. So mindfulness, you may be hearing about that a lot. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness. It's been associated with many benefits, physical, mental benefits. And mindfulness is very simple. It's also something that you can do anywhere and can take anywhere. Mindfulness is about just being in the present moment. And so you're going to focus on what's with you right now, right here. You can pay attention to the sensation of your feet on the floor, if your feet are on the floor. Whatever is supporting you, whether you're sitting in a chair, lying on a bed, whatever. You can think about the sensation of that support against your body, what that feels like. Is it hard? Is it soft? You can think about what your clothes feel like on your skin. You can think about any environmental sounds that you hear. You can focus on your breath. What we were just doing was very much a mindfulness exercise by focusing inward on your breath. You can survey your body and look for areas of tension. That is also a body scan can be a mindfulness exercise. So mindfulness counters that tendency that we have to dwell on the past, to ruminate about it, to rehash the past, or to fret about the future. And I once read, this was not a scientific study, but I read someone say that we spend 90% of our time thinking backwards or thinking forwards and not being in the present moment. And so that is, that's a shame, because the present is really all that we are guaranteed, but also because it means you're not getting any of those benefits of mindfulness. And you know that rehashing the past, you don't get many do-overs, if any. And so rehashing that doesn't really help you in any way. And fretting about the future, a cancer diagnosis can certainly lead to a lot of fretting about the future, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything most of the time. Sometimes there's things that you can fret about and have a good idea, a way to do something differently. But mindfulness connects you with the present moment and can be very soothing and calming to your body. And I have a little box there about Oprah's program. A couple of years ago, Oprah was advocating meditation, and she was saying, just do it for a minute. You know, it doesn't have to be very long. Do it for a minute, and for a week, meditate for a minute every day, and then the next week add another minute. That's all, just at one other minute. And that by the end of the year, you would have built up your capacity to meditate for 52 minutes. So almost an hour of meditation. Meditation is like a skill. Mindfulness is a skill. And so this was a way that Oprah was recommending to practice it. And the other thing that I want to say is that when you're doing mindfulness, we're all human, and your mind will wander. It's no big deal. Don't get frustrated about it. Just bring your attention back where you want it to be, on your breath, on your the sounds that you're listening to, whatever. Just bring yourself back to the focus that you've chosen. And just do that as many times as you need to, for as long as you want to practice mindfulness. Okay, we're going to go on to the second set of strategies. And I just thought you might enjoy this image, whether you see it as a frog or a horse. It's one of those things that, you know, it's the same drawing. We see it different ways. And so we're talking about changing your focus. And you might have a hard time shifting focus between the frog and a horse. If you see it one way, it can be very difficult to see it the other way. But we're going to talk about shifting the way you think about things a little bit. So this first one is the notion that the outcomes of what you do don't determine your worth. So, for example, if you're in a caregiving situation and the person that you're caring for gets sick in some way, or their disease gets worse, it doesn't have to be about what you did. You haven't failed. That's just what happens. That's what illness happens. Sometimes when as a psychologist, I would be working with people about why did I get diagnosed with cancer? And it could be that you lived the most healthy lifestyle. Sometimes those things just happen, and it's not because we've done something wrong. We tend to fall into that trap easily, that it must be something I did. And as a caregiver, worrying that is it something I did that caused this problem. But what if you made the goal of your work or your caregiving to just do your best. Could you be okay with that? Would you allow that to be enough to do your best and not feel like it's only okay if I get the best outcome, or if it's only okay if I win? It's kind of like that notion of, we've all seen the second place team dissolve in tears or frustration when they haven't won the championship, or when they've won the silver medal versus the gold medal. And what if we said it was okay if you made it as far as you did, if you tried your best? What if that was okay versus you have to get a perfect outcome? It's all a cognitive shift. It's just thinking about it differently. Doesn't mean that you have to do anything differently, but you just choose to think about it differently, to cut yourself some slack. Another cognitive shift that I want to talk about is gratitude. And you may have seen something about that because that's been getting some attention in the popular press. The benefits of gratitude. And these little boxes that I have, these are research results about the effects of gratitude. So gratitude decreases your negative emotions, and it increases positive factors or emotions to practice gratitude. There was a study that showed doing a gratitude journal for 15 minutes before going to bed at night improved sleep for that night. And also gratitude fosters resilience. So this is something that all of us can do, and it's just a matter of drawing our attention to things that we're grateful for. And it doesn't have to be something dramatic. It can be the fact that it was a sunny day. So I live in St. Louis. The news was saying that we have had 1 out of 3 days this winter has been either rainy or snowy, and that doesn't include just the cloudy days. I know some folks who are really struggling with the weather being so dreary. But do we turn that around, and on the days that it is sunny, are we grateful for that? Just grateful for sunshine, grateful for nice weather, grateful for a friend calling, grateful for some nice something that you had to eat. But it can be very simple things, but it's the practice of recognizing those things, of bringing them to mind, that's important. So that's another shift that everyone can do. Now I have a slide here about Stephen Hayes is a psychologist who developed acceptance commitment therapy. And I've got in the bottom of the slide a couple of books about it if it's something that you find intriguing. But acceptance commitment therapy is about these 3 things. So show up. It means don't be distracted, don't be disengaged. Show up, connect with what's here now, so that mindfulness aspect. So rather than, again, being all consumed about what happened last week or what might happen next month, be in the present. And then the third aspect is do what you care about. Figure out what's important to you and move towards it. So these are some ways to develop cognitive flexibility, to develop resilience. So again, if you have interest in learning more about that, the Happiness Trap is both of these at the bottom are self-help books that you can use if you find that interesting. Now let's talk about the third tool, and that is about being intentional. So this notion of choosing versus somebody's making me do it. And again, it could be a subtle thing, but just to try to own what you do rather than thinking, okay, I just do, I have to, I have no choice. What if you made it a choice that, say, I'm going to just draw on an example here for a moment, but maybe I don't like doing the dishes. The dishes have to be done, so I do it because I have to. But what if I chose, you know what, I'm going to just try to shift the way I think about those dishes. I'm going to choose to do the dishes and make it my choice, rather than that awful task I have to get around to. It's a little subtle shift, but this idea to choose what you're doing. So with caregiving, if that's something that you're doing, can you choose it? Even if you've been doing it for a while, maybe you started for other reasons, but could you decide now to choose that I'm going to choose this? This helps you to feel more a sense of autonomy rather than, okay, I just go around all the time doing things that other people make me do or ask me to do, but I'm doing this because I choose to. So it brings back that autonomy. And if you can relate it to your sense of mission or purpose that we talked about before, all the better. Another aspect of this, we're talking about self-care here, and we have one specific little tool, strategy of self-care, but not waiting for somebody else to make things better, but you choosing to take care of yourself. So any of the things that we're talking about doing, you choosing to do those, to take care of yourself versus that you're doing it because of whatever. So this is about this self-care aspect, that's something that you can, rather than waiting for, things will get better when my sister helps with this caregiving I'm doing, or things will get better when my loved one is feeling better, or even if you're somebody who's dealing with illness, okay, when I get better, then it's all going to be okay. Don't wait for X, Y, or Z. What can you do now to take better care of yourself, to build your resilience? Okay, so I told you I'd get back to support system, and here we are. So the support system is the people who are available to you to listen, to help, whatever. And hopefully you have that community already. If not, maybe that's something you need to create. But you want something reciprocal. A lot of folks who become caregivers, they tend to do that role all the time. Rather than receiving care or support, they're much more comfortable giving it, and that can be the path to burnout. So having some reciprocal relationships where you give support, but you also get it, and this can be formal, like family ties or colleagues at work or something, but it can also be informal, and so both of those are possible. Now, a couple of things you can do. So with your support systems, one, you can empower a few people to draw your attention to when you're feeling overwhelmed. They may be aware of that before you are. You're just putting one foot in front of the other. But maybe they see that it's starting to get you a bit. And don't ask them to do that if you're not going to be able to receive it, okay? You don't want to set them up to get in trouble. But to consider asking a few people to just draw your attention if you seem to be getting a little overwhelmed or burnt out. And hopefully you can receive that okay if they do that, and use that as a wake-up call to try to do some things to take care of yourself. Another aspect of that is telling on yourself. So if you are struggling, to just speak it, own up to it, say it. Might make it easier for them to tell you when they're having the same experience, but to say what you're struggling with, say what you're embarrassed about, but rather than just feeling like you gotta look like you've got it all together or you're on top of things and everything's great, to let yourself acknowledge when you're struggling a bit. Okay, our last strategy is about self-care. I forecasted that previously, said we were going to get here. And I want to present this concept of your coping reserve. So everybody has their coping reserves, how much they can take before they have, they've just had it. And think of those coping reserves like a bank account. And if you're in a situation where there are a lot of hits on your coping reserves, a lot of things that are drawing on your coping reserves, you have to figure out a way to make more deposits, or the account is going to be busted, bankrupted. So, whether you have just a regular way of making deposits, or if you're starting to have some concern because of the amount of withdrawals, and you get proactive about making deposits, either way is fine. But to have that balance in your account, you need to attend to the things that you do to rebuild your coping reserves, to increase your hardiness. So another word about self-care is that it needs to be intentional, so that you do it on purpose, not like, okay, oh gosh, I don't know, just accidentally I fell into that, but to make it something that you do actively and intentionally, rather than just, I get lucky if somebody happens to offer something that works in that regard. So being intentional about those activities. And here's a list of some potential self-care activities. So practicing relaxation, like we already talked about. Taking care of your body, so what your body needs. Getting enough sleep, exercising, eating right, the things that we need to do to just take care of our physical plant. That's also self-care. Scheduling some things you enjoy. So rather than life being all about work or drudgery or tasks, but make sure that you have something on the horizon that you look forward to, that you can enjoy. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but it can also, it can be a little thing easily, but just it needs to be intentional. Taking time for yourself, even if it's just a few moments. There's a strategy for healthcare professionals where they've talked about, before you go into a room, just pause with your hand on the doorknob, just for a moment, and just maybe do some mindfulness, whatever, just taking a moment to collect yourself. So sometimes that it doesn't have to be lengthy. If it can be, that's great. But take some time for yourself, just to be, to do something for you. Now, somebody proposed this to me one time. I don't remember where it came from now. It's been long enough. But one possibility, you can kind of refresh yourself by doing the opposite of what you do all the time. So, for example, if you spend all day indoors, just think about doing something outdoors to mix it up a bit. If you spend all day around people, maybe you need some time alone. You spend all day in your head doing that kind of task or work, maybe you need to do something physical. So think about what you do. Maybe you're structured all the time. You're always doing things. Maybe you need to just not do things for a while, just have some unstructured time. But to think about what's the opposite, that can be very refreshing sometimes. Now, I like this image. And so if this is what your life feels like, an overflowing sink, so you need to either decrease the flow of the water into that overflowing sink, however you can, getting help, whatever, or you need to increase the drainage. And the self-care, those things are the drainage. The strategies that we've talked about can be the drainage. And if you need to decrease the flow, it maybe you need to step away for a bit from what you're trying to do to just recover a bit. Okay, so think about what's your resilience plan, what you can do to take care of yourself, to help yourself be resilient in the face of what you're trying to do. I encourage you to write it down and then to be intentional about implementing it. So once a day, I'm going to pick something off my resilience plan and do it, or I'm going to just have do a mindfulness exercise every evening before I go to bed, or even like a gratitude exercise. I'm going to make sure I get lunch in every day, whatever, but just to be intentional about it and then actually do it. No, Nike claimed that already as their slogan, but you can borrow it and just practice that resilience plan. Just do it. I have one final quote from Viktor Frankl again, the person we talked about before, that psychiatrist. And he said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And that space is our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. So that moment where you can choose, am I just going to keep banging my head on that wall, or am I going to try to do something else? Am I going to, is that going to be something that's restorative for me? So taking that opportunity to do something to help yourself where you can, or to dial down the pressure where you can. Okay, so that is what I wanted to present today. I think we have 10 minutes for questions, if there's any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deshields. That's a great presentation. Give me just a moment while I pull up the questions. And to those of you on the line listening live, if you do have questions, please type them in and I will ask them. So our first question, excuse me, as a caregiver, I often feel guilt when compassion fatigue comes up. What is a way to deal with that, and is that normal?
Great question. It is very normal to feel guilty, and especially if you are blessed or cursed with that trait of perfectionism, where you're feeling like you need to always be doing things perfectly, always be available, always being whatever that list is in your own head, that can give you lots of fodder for guilt. So guilt is oftentimes self-imposed, and that means it's something that we can choose to try to do differently. Sometimes it's coming from others who are piling that on us. If you've experienced that, you know what I mean there. But if it's something that is coming from yourself, you can try to a cognitive shift. Try to say, I'm doing the best I can, and that's what I can deliver today. So trying a shift of that sort. Don't beat yourself up about it. Guilt is very common, and there's lots of ways that you can find to feel guilty. If that's your particular vice, you'll find lots of ways to go down that road. But just decide, choose to not indulge that, perhaps. I bet if you talk with if you have a support system where you can talk with folks about it, people will resonate and say, oh, that happens to me too. That can sometimes diffuse some of the thinking, gosh, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel that way and others don't? To find out how common it is. But I encourage you to work on it.
Okay, another question. Thank you. At what point would it be necessary to seek a mental health professional?
Another great question. So if you feel like you've tried to address the challenges you're facing on your own and it's just not working, I encourage you to see a mental health professional. And it doesn't have to be that you're signing up for a long course of therapy. Many counselors or mental health professionals will work with you on what's the current problem and how do we get this better, and in a short-term way. Or you can ask that to begin with, what's your approach to care, and I'd like to have a short-term treatment. So that's more and more common. And if you want a longer-term treatment, that's fine too, but it doesn't have to be. Some people get intimidated that if I sign up for something, I'm going to be stuck in something that I don't enjoy. I do encourage you to try out different ways to get the help, maybe a support group, maybe seeing a counselor, maybe some self-help materials. I encourage you to try it and continue what works for you and drop what doesn't work for you. Now, try it for more than 10 minutes, give it a good try, but try and keep working until you find the thing that works for you. And that may mean that it's the approach, or it may mean a particular therapist or whatever, but don't give up when things don't fit right off the bat. Just keep trying to find what works best for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. How does compassion fatigue fit in with bereavement?
Okay, so bereavement would imply that somebody has suffered a loss, and compassion fatigue could be the result of lots of instances of bereavement. So maybe you've had quite a few people die, and you've gotten overwhelmed by that. There's also something called complicated bereavement, but it's bereavement that doesn't resolve in a timely manner. Like, say if bereavement persists and doesn't improve but gets worse, that is complicated bereavement, and that is something that people can get help for as well, like in a support group or from a counselor or from reading that you do. But so they can be related. People can have compassion fatigue without having experienced bereavement, and people can have bereavement without having had any compassion fatigue. So they can be independent, but they can also coexist. Kind of a double whammy.
Sure, thank you. I think we have a couple more minutes. Let's see, our next question. What do you recommend for patients who notice that their caregivers may be experiencing compassion fatigue?
You know, I would say one very healthy thing to do would be to talk about it, to bring it up. I know that, so in my work at my cancer center for 18 years, I got to work with people with cancer. I got to work with family members, caregivers. And what I found is that sometimes in loving relationships, people try to protect each other, and in trying to protect each other, they stop talking about things. They try to protect their loved ones from their own struggles. And so it short circuits the conversation in trying to protect each other. And you can lose some of that intimacy that way. So I encourage you, if you observe that, I encourage you to bring it up and talk about it. And can we agree that we will we'll tell each other when we're having a hard time? That would be a very positive step in the right direction. You can try to encourage them that, you know, I want you to I want you to be okay in this caregiving experience. I don't want you to suffer with this. What can we do? How can we make things better? What resources can we draw on to make this better or easier for all of us? So I encourage conversation about it, talking about it directly, and then maybe you need to go together to see someone to facilitate that conversation if it's too hard to do on your own. But I think talking about it is the most important first step.
Thank you. We do have another question about getting a copy of the presentation. And yes, since everyone that registers for the event, you will get an email tomorrow with the link to the recording of the webinar and also a link to the slides. I'm not seeing any additional questions. I guess that wraps it up. Dr. Deshields, thank you so much for everything and for a great presentation. And yeah, any final comments or anything before we wrap up?
No, this has been wonderful. I've enjoyed it, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.